Motivation is emotional. Discipline is structural. Motivation rises when the mood is right and disappears when life becomes difficult. Discipline, however, does not ask how you feel. It reflects how your inner world is organized. Carl Jung understood that lasting change is not produced by bursts of enthusiasm, but by psychological alignment. When the psyche is coherent, action follows naturally. When it is fragmented, motivation must constantly be chased. Discipline works better because it is not dependent on emotion. It emerges from identity, meaning, and inner agreement. Resolve the inner conflict, and effort becomes stable. Motivation is rooted in emotion, and emotion is by nature unstable. It rises in moments of excitement, hope, or urgency, and fades just as quickly when resistance appears. This is not a flaw in character, but a property of the psyche itself. Feelings respond to circumstance, to novelty, to imagination. They are not designed to carry a person steadily through repetition, difficulty, or boredom. When we rely on motivation alone, we tie our actions to moods we do not control. Discipline, by contrast, belongs to a deeper psychological layer. It is not an emotion but a structure, where motivation asks, "Do I feel like acting?" Discipline answers, "This is how I act." One fluctuates with inner weather. The other reflects inner organization. When a person confuses the two, they begin to chase enthusiasm instead of building coherence. They wait for the right feeling to appear before they move. Life then becomes reactive rather than directed. I have observed that people often blame themselves for lacking motivation when the true issue is fragmentation. Different parts of the psyche want different things. One part desires growth, another seeks comfort, another fears failure. Motivation surges when these parts briefly agree, then collapses when conflict returns. Discipline works better because it does not require constant agreement. It provides continuity even when the psyche feels divided. This is why discipline can feel dull at first. It lacks the emotional reward that motivation offers. But this dullness is not emptiness. It is stability. Over time, stability becomes strength. The psyche begins to trust what is consistent. Action no longer needs emotional justification each day. The energy once spent negotiating with oneself becomes available for the work itself. Motivation is persuasive, but discipline is reliable. Motivation inspires beginnings. Discipline sustains continuation. A life guided by motivation alone becomes a series of starts and stops, peaks and collapses. A life guided by discipline moves steadily even when enthusiasm is absent. This steadiness builds confidence of a different kind, not excitement but self-trust. Discipline does not suppress emotion, it outlasts it. Feelings still arise, but they no longer dictate behavior. The individual becomes less dependent on inner fluctuation and more grounded in inner form. This grounding is not rigid, it allows flexibility without chaos. And perhaps this is the essential insight. Motivation may open the door, but only discipline carries you through it when the feeling fades. Discipline reveals the state of inner alignment more clearly than any declaration of intention. When a person acts consistently, it is not because they are unusually strong, but because their inner world is not divided. Conscious goals and unconscious values move in the same direction. In such a state, action feels almost ordinary. There is no constant inner debate, no exhausting self-persuasion. Psyche cooperates. When alignment is missing, discipline feels heavy. One part of the personality insists on improvement, while another quietly resists. The ego may believe it has chosen a goal freely, yet the unconscious has not agreed. This disagreement expresses itself as delay, distraction, or fatigue. What appears as lack of discipline is often the psyche signaling that something is out of place. I have often emphasized that the unconscious is not an enemy to be conquered. It is a partner that must be understood. When discipline collapses repeatedly, it is not a moral failure. It is a psychological message. The unconscious is asking whether the chosen path reflects genuine values or merely borrowed ideals. Many people pursue goals that were never truly theirs. They imitate what society praises, and then wonder why they cannot sustain effort. Alignment begins with honest reflection. One must ask not only what is desired, but why. When goals are rooted in fear, comparison, or the need for approval, the unconscious resists, senses the lack of authenticity. Discipline imposed on such foundations requires constant force and eventually breaks down. When goals emerge from inner necessity, the psyche supports them quietly. As alignment strengthens, discipline changes quality. It becomes less dramatic. One does not feel heroic for acting, nor ashamed for resting. Action becomes proportionate. The psyche recognizes its own direction and moves without protest. Even difficult tasks feel manageable because they are not experienced as violations of the self. This inner agreement also protects against burnout. When discipline flows from alignment, energy is replenished rather than drained. Effort does not feel like self-betrayal. It feels like participation in one's own development. The individual trusts themselves because they have experienced consistency without coercion. Alignment does not mean rigidity. It allows adjustment. When circumstances change, the psyche adapts without collapse. Discipline remains flexible because it is grounded in meaning rather than fear. And perhaps this is the quiet truth behind consistency. Discipline endures not because you force yourself forward, but because nothing within you is pulling you back. Motivation often collapses not because a person lacks desire, but because something within them has been ignored. What we call enthusiasm usually belongs to the conscious mind. It is optimistic, future-oriented, and eager to change. The shadow, however, holds what has been rejected: doubts, fears, fatigue, resentment, even a wish to remain as one is. When this shadow is ignored, it does not disappear. It undermines motivation quietly from below. Many people try to motivate themselves by repeating goals, affirmations, or ideals. They speak to the conscious mind while the unconscious remains unheard. The shadow then responds in its own language: procrastination, distraction, forgetfulness, or sudden loss of energy. These are not random failures. They are expressions of inner conflict. One part of the psyche is being pushed forward while another is being silenced. I have often found that the stronger the motivation at the surface, the stronger the resistance beneath it. This is because motivation is frequently built on repression. A person tells themselves they must become disciplined, productive, or focused. While a hidden part feels overworked, unrecognized, or coerced, the psyche cannot sustain this imbalance for long. Eventually, enthusiasm burns out and leaves confusion in its place. Discipline works better than motivation because it does not rely on emotional highs. But even discipline fails when the shadow is ignored. True consistency requires integration. The shadow must be acknowledged, not obeyed blindly, but understood. When resistance appears, the question should not be, how do I push harder? But what part of me is not being heard? Often the shadow contains legitimate needs: rest, autonomy, creativity, or protection from shame. When these needs are recognized consciously, they no longer need to sabotage behavior unconsciously. The psyche relaxes. Motivation no longer has to fight against an unseen force. Discipline becomes steadier because it is no longer built on denial. This integration does not weaken discipline, it strengthens it. The individual becomes less dramatic with themselves. They stop oscillating between intense motivation and collapse. Action becomes measured, humane, and sustainable. The ego learns to lead without tyranny. When the shadow is brought into awareness, effort changes character. One no longer feels divided. The inner voice softens. Resistance loses its urgency. What once felt like self-control begins to feel like self-respect. And perhaps this is the overlooked truth. Motivation fades when parts of you are excluded. But discipline endures when the whole psyche is allowed to participate. Identity is the silent force behind all sustained behavior. Long before conscious effort appears, the psyche has already decided what feels natural and what feels foreign. This is why discipline cannot survive on motivation alone. Motivation attempts to push behavior forward, but identity determines whether that behavior feels like an expression of the self or a violation of it. I have seen many people attempt to live in ways that contradict how they understand themselves. They adopt routines, goals, and structures that belong to an image they admire rather than to their actual psychological state. At first, motivation carries them. They feel inspired by the possibility of becoming someone else. But inspiration fades quickly when identity has not shifted. The psyche resists what it does not recognize as its own. Discipline becomes reliable only when behavior aligns with self-image. A person who sees themselves as inconsistent will unconsciously restore inconsistency, even while consciously desiring order. This is not sabotage, it is coherence. The psyche prefers internal consistency over improvement. Until the sense of self changes, discipline must be forced, and force always exhausts. Identity does not change through declaration. Saying I am disciplined does little if experience contradicts it. Identity changes through lived evidence. Small, repeated actions accumulate quietly, reshaping how the psyche understands itself. When someone consistently shows up in a modest, humane way, the unconscious takes note. Gradually, discipline stops feeling imposed and begins to feel expected. This is why discipline rooted in identity survives boredom, fatigue, and doubt. It does not require constant motivation because it is no longer experienced as effort. One does not ask whether to act any more than one asks whether to speak one's native language. The behavior fits. The psyche cooperates because nothing is being violated. Importantly, this process requires patience. Identity reshapes slowly. When people demand immediate transformation, they often abandon the process prematurely. They interpret discomfort as failure instead of adjustment. But discipline grows strongest, not through intensity, but through continuity. Small consistency is psychologically more powerful than dramatic effort. As identity stabilizes, motivation becomes less important. Feelings still come and go, but they no longer govern behavior. Action continues because it reflects who one has become. The ego stops negotiating daily with itself. Inner friction decreases. And perhaps this is the deeper reason discipline works better than motivation. Motivation tries to move behavior, but identity carries it forward without effort. Motivation fades because it depends on feeling, and feeling is always in motion. Meaning, however, belongs to a deeper layer of the psyche. It endures when emotion weakens. I have often observed that a person can withstand great difficulty if they know why they are doing so, yet become exhausted by even minor effort when the reason feels empty. This is not a question of strength, but of significance. Discipline collapses when it is reduced to obligation. When action is driven by external pressure, comparison, or fear of failure, the psyche resists. It senses that effort is being demanded without inner justification. In such cases, discipline feels like self-betrayal. The unconscious withdraws energy, and motivation evaporates. What remains is fatigue and self-criticism, meaning restores continuity. When an action is connected to something personally true, effort feels different. One is no longer pushing against oneself. The psyche recognizes the direction and supports it quietly. This does not mean discipline becomes easy in a superficial sense. Difficulty remains. What changes is the inner relationship to effort. One no longer asks, "Why am I doing this?" because the answer is already present. Meaning does not need to be grand or heroic. It does not require distant visions or dramatic purpose. Often it emerges from a simple alignment with values, integrity, growth, responsibility, or care for something beyond the ego. When discipline serves such values, it becomes sustainable. The psyche prefers coherence over comfort. When effort reflects inner truth, resistance weakens. Many people attempt to replace meaning with rewards or punishments. These methods work briefly, but they do not last. The unconscious does not respond to incentives in the way the conscious mind imagines. It responds to relevance. If an action feels disconnected from the self, no amount of motivation will sustain it. When an action feels meaningful, motivation becomes unnecessary. This is why discipline rooted in meaning survives periods of low energy or doubt. Even when enthusiasm disappears, direction remains. One continues not because it feels good, but because it feels right. This distinction is crucial. Feelings fluctuate, meaning stabilizes. As meaning deepens, discipline becomes quieter. There is less internal argument, less need for encouragement. The individual acts with a sense of inner permission. Effort becomes a form of participation in one's own development rather than a struggle against oneself. The psyche begins to trust the path it is on. And perhaps this is the truth most often overlooked. Motivation excites the surface of the mind, but meaning anchors the whole personality, and only what is anchored can endure. Discipline reaches its most stable form not when it is forced, but when it emerges as a natural expression of individuation. Individuation is the process by which a person becomes a psychological whole, rather than a collection of competing parts. When this process is incomplete, effort feels conflicted. One part of the psyche pushes forward, another pulls back, and discipline becomes a daily struggle. But as individuation unfolds, these inner oppositions begin to organize themselves around a deeper center. I have often noted that when the self becomes more central than the ego, behavior changes without constant effort. The ego no longer needs to supervise every action. The psyche moves with a sense of inner necessity. Discipline at this stage is no longer something you apply. It is something that appears. Action flows because it reflects the person's true direction, not an imposed ideal. This is why discipline rooted in individuation feels quieter than motivation. There is less inner dialogue, less self-criticism, less emotional drama. One acts because action feels congruent, not because one is chasing a feeling or avoiding guilt. The personality has found its axis. Energy that was once wasted on internal negotiation becomes available for living itself. Individuation also protects discipline from collapse. Because behavior is grounded in wholeness rather than mood, it endures periods of fatigue, boredom, and uncertainty. These states no longer threaten consistency. They are integrated as part of the human condition. The individual adjusts without abandoning themselves. Discipline remains flexible because it is not rigidly enforced. Importantly, this form of discipline does not harden the personality. It allows rest without shame and effort without resentment. Structure becomes supportive rather than restrictive. The psyche trusts itself because it has experienced consistency without coercion. This trust deepens self-respect and stabilizes behavior further. Many search for techniques to become disciplined, yet overlook this deeper transformation. Techniques may help temporarily, but they cannot replace psychological maturity. Discipline that emerges from individuation is resilient because it is no longer dependent on external systems or inner pressure. It is sustained by inner agreement. As the individual becomes more whole, discipline stops being a personal project and becomes a natural condition. Life feels guided rather than managed. One no longer asks whether discipline will last, because it is no longer held together by force. And perhaps this is the final insight. Discipline works better than motivation because it is not driven by emotion, but by wholeness, and what is whole does not need to be pushed forward.